guys. And I'll tell you what, the Grateful Dead would not have become who they became without these guys. They were not your ordinary roadies by any stretch. So some of you have seen these puzzling photos of the Grateful Dead on horseback. Here's a story. When the band committed to appear in a movie, a musical western called Zachariah, they had to learn to ride. Everyone showed up for riding lessons at Mickey's with varying degrees of enthusiasm. One afternoon, Mickey took them across Nevada Boulevard to the Bundason Ranch for a leisurely trail ride. By the time they were ready to head back after dismounting for a smoke break, the sun was getting low on the western hills. As the guys were remounting, Mickey noticed that Jerry was trying to mount his horse from the right side, and he called out, "Hey man, the other side, go around to the other side." But it was too late. The cinch was loose, and as Jerry pulled on the saddle horn, the saddle shifted toward him, causing the horse to step sideways and knock Jerry down onto a large rock, cracking one of his ribs. He managed to get on the horse to ride back to Mickey's, but that was the last time he ever rode. Well, it was the first time, too. He was pretty scared of horses. He never did go to the doctor, and very few people knew of his injury. It was Mountain Girl that told me the story. In the end, Country Joe and the Fish ended up playing the band of musicians on horseback in Zachariah. Yeah, that's me. In the fall of 1969, I moved out of the Fairfax house that I'd shared with Phil, and the story of our breakup is chronicled in our book. For the next few months, I stayed with friends, moved around a lot, and did what I could to recover from the breakup. I went to work for Alembic, who handled the sound and the recording for the Dead. Eventually, my transition to a new life within my old scene became more comfortable. But just as I was starting to pull myself back together, I got whacked upside the head by a new bummer. Altamont. It's amazing how that one word can conjure up such a horrific flood of bad memories in people who were there at the ill-fated Rolling Stones concert at Altamont Speedway on December 6, 1969. The closer they were to the stage and the center of the action, the more their memories must seem like a twisted nightmare. And this is from my book. I rode to Altamont with Jonathan in his big stake bed truck, headed for a middle-of-the-night setup at the hastily arranged concert site. While he and the rest of the crew unloaded the truck under work lights, I curled up on the front seat under a packing blanket and I fell asleep. When I woke up, it was just getting light. It was damp and freezing cold, and the skies were gray and gloomy. I had to find a porta potty, so I stretched and I climbed down from the cab. As I walked around to where I could see the audience, I was startled at how many people were already there. By some later estimates, 150,000 people had arrived during the night. I walked up the hill away from the stage, took care of my business, and then continued wandering through the carpet of bodies, stopping here and there to talk to people and share a few tokes. On my way back toward the stage, I made a drastically wrong decision in my early morning mind fog. I took a big swallow of orange juice from a gallon jug offered to me by a friendly hippie. A drink that would alter my consciousness and the direction that my day would take. The juice had been heavily laced with some kind of toxic psychedelic cocktail. And you may have read about it in the intervening years, but I was one of several hundred people that suffered from this very toxic dosing. So it was a pretty awful day. I survived Altamont, but just barely. The short-term PTSD sent me to a shrink for the first time in my life when I couldn't stop having nightmares. During the next year and a half, I took a couple of detours, all outlined with photos or detailed with photos in my book. I went on a cross-country filmmaking odyssey called the Medicine Ball Caravan without the dead, but with most of my North Beach friends and the entire crew of Alembic. It was followed by returning to Paris for the first time since I'd left there as a child. I changed my name from Florence Louise Nathan to Rosie McGee. And yes, there is a story behind that, and it's in my book. And by the way, not a drop of Irish blood. And I came into my own as a single woman within the Grateful Dead family. And now moving on to 1971 and another story that takes place in Paris and involves the Grateful Dead. Got a passport? You want to go to Paris? We need you to speak French. With these words, John McIntyre roused me out of my lethargy in Alembic's stuffy office one weekday in 1971. Day after tomorrow. We'll be gone 5 days. You and I will go ahead of the band. I'll explain on the plane. 2 days later, John and I got on a plane and headed for Paris, where we spent a glorious night at the Hotel Crillon, the most expensive and luxurious hotel in Paris, paid for by the French fashion designer who had booked the Dead for a huge outdoor festival. Unfortunately, a deluge of a rainstorm forced an abrupt cancellation of the festival. But the band and the crew were already on the plane, and they wouldn't know of the cancellation until they'd landed. When John and I got to the airport an hour before their arrival, the rental cars were available and John secured them with my assistance. But there was no truck. Festival or no festival, we couldn't be separated from our gear, so it was essential that we get a truck. John gave me the assignment and left me with some French currency and 2 members of the crew, and then John took off with the band to our lodgings at the 17th century Chateau d'Hérouville, 35 miles away. It was evening by the time we pulled into the chateau driveway with the band's gear. We were greeted by applause and a lovely meal was served in the dining hall. We awoke the next morning to a perfect blue sky summer morning and breakfast. What to do? We were less than 40 miles from Paris. We had cars, at least 2 interpreters, and no responsibilities. So most of us split up into the cars and headed for Paris. John, Phil, and a few others decided to go to Notre Dame Cathedral. But I headed straight for the Eiffel Tower with Garcia, Weir, Kreutzmann, Hunter, and a couple of other people. Despite the fact that the Eiffel Tower is probably the single most crowded location in France during the month of June, it was my pleasure to shepherd the guys on their tour, pointing out the landmarks of my city from the windy second-floor landing. By the way, you probably recognize upper right is Robert Hunter and Weir, and lower right is John McIntyre. For the most part, they were just tourists like any other, but it had to happen. A couple of long-haired guys from Mill Valley came around one of the corners, practically crashing into Jerry, and then staring at him with a, "Oh my God, far out, man, wow, I can't believe this," before they recovered and shook his hand. As usual, Jerry was gracious and affable with them. We took a nice stroll through the trees of the Champ de Mars next to the Eiffel Tower, then along the Seine, before having lunch at a sidewalk cafe. We eventually drove back to Hérouville, taking a few detours along the way. It was a fabulous day, and when all of us reunited over dinner, we had many stories to share. The only person at Hérouville who seemed to be having a poor time of it was Pigpen. He wasn't feeling well. He didn't participate in any excursions, and he stayed to himself most of the time we were there. I tried to get him to come to Paris with us, but he just shook his head, said, "No thanks. I think I'll just stay here." Sadly, Pigpen was in worse health than any of us knew, perhaps even himself. He passed away only 2 years later at the age of 27. And that brings us to Europe 72. This wonderful photograph, reproduced in black and white on the cover of my book, was taken by Mary Ann Mayer, who the Dead hired to photograph the Europe 72 tour. Sometime around 1967, the Dead and some of the family were sitting around talking about how much fun it would be to go to Europe together. Someone asked, well, who'd get to go? Pulled out a piece of paper to start a list, and everybody we could possibly think of added up to 25 people. The band pledged that whenever it finally happened, whoever was around from that original list would get to go on the Dead's first European tour. 5 years later, 1972, the Dead made good on their promise. The list had grown to around 50, but I was still on it. Of course, it helped my cause that I spoke fluent French, having demonstrated that value in Aéroville. In 1973, Frankie Weir's girlfriend, wanted to find a way for her and the other band girlfriends and wives to join their guys on the road more often. She opened a travel agency, Fly-by-Night Travel, and lured me away from Alembic to work for her as the travel agent for the Dead, the New Riders, and several other bands and entertainers. I could now more easily afford to see the Dead on the road, such as this show at UC Santa Barbara, May 20th, 1973. I believe the retail cost of an airline ticket from San Francisco to LA, round trip, was $33, including tax. And here in 1973, we have the bear, obviously, on the left, and Jerry and Bobby. The fly-by-night travel job was the most demanding and difficult job I'd ever had. Keep in mind, this was before computers on every desk, fax machines in every office, and boarding passes printed out just before you go. I did everything by hand or on the telephone, and by the end of a year in that job, I was seriously burned out and exhausted. The band had become a popular, hard-traveling road band. Cocaine had taken over the minds and personalities of many people in our environment, and overall, it just wasn't as much fun as it used to be, to put it mildly. So when I met a kind and quiet guy who lived in New Mexico, and we fell in love, I didn't hesitate to leave the scene behind to follow my heart and follow him back to New Mexico. Of course, as many of you in this room know, there's no such thing as leaving this scene behind. And so I drove off into the sunset, well, actually it was the sunrise, to go live with my new sweetie in Taos. And that, my friends, is where the book, Dancing with the Dead, a photographic memoir, ends. But we're not quite done. Let me end this presentation with some words from the afterword of my book, written in an email from my friend Edward Baer, one of the original freeform DJs from Tom Donahue's KMPX and KSAN radio stations. His email to me was in response to a question I had asked him. I'd reached a crossroads in the writing of my book where I'd started to doubt my memories, and I asked him, was it all as meaningful as I remembered it? And here was Edward's eloquent reply. We were at one of the centers of a golden moment in human history, where so many good things came together in one place at one time. We were generating light and love from the music and the radio, from the ideas, the literature, the posters, the light shows, the clothing, and the fiber art. the healthier kitchens and the sexier bedrooms. It all helped us to know what it was like to live as people at peace, with freedom and generosity for all. What you remember was true. All of us who were touched so deeply by each other and that exceptional moment were changed by it forever. That's one way to know for sure that yes, it all really happened. Thank you. If we have time, anybody needs to give me the hook, go ahead. Okay, I don't know, I've lost my sense of time in that one.